So I've been conducting a lot of year-end financial reviews with clients lately. And as part of those meetings, I walk through the year-to-date performance of their portfolios, highlighting what each asset class has contributed to the overall return on their portfolio, with the asset classes being equities, real estate, alternatives, and bonds. And I got to thinking it would really make my day if someone were to stop me and ask some questions about their bond holdings. After all, I spent more than half of my career analyzing and investing in bonds. But alas, the bond question rarely, if ever, comes up. So while you may not have asked for it, I plan to give you a crash course on the US bond market nonetheless. It just might be more interesting and multidimensional than you think. This is not a video about what a bond is, nor is it about recent performance or how bond returns correlate with stock market returns. Instead, it's primarily about the main types of bonds issued in the US. And what better way to do that than to look at the most widely followed US bond index, the Bloomberg US Aggregate Bond Index, or simply the AG. The AG tracks about $30 trillion in US bonds. To put that in perspective, the S&P 500 tracks about $50 trillion in US stocks. Let's get to the meat of it. What are the types of bonds in the AG? And by the way, these are bonds that you hold in your portfolios through mutual funds and ETFs. The US Treasuries make up the single largest type of bond in the index, accounting for 43%. The US government issues these bonds to pay for national defense, healthcare, education, infrastructure, etc. You are, in essence, lending money to the government when you buy these. Next up, we have corporate bonds, which make up about 25% of the index. Most of the big US companies that you know all too well on the stock side also are corporate bond issuers. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Walmart, JP Morgan. They all have corporate bonds outstanding. I think it would be helpful here to discuss a recently issued corporate bond. Yesterday, the big oil company ConocoPhillips issued corporate bonds, or in other words, it borrowed money from investors like you and me. The bond proceeds will be used to help pay for its acquisition of another big oil company, Marathon Oil. Now consider for a moment if you'd personally buy these newly issued 10-year bonds. Would you be willing to lend to Conoco for 10 years? Its credit quality is good, so your natural next question would be, what is Conoco willing to pay you each year for the money it's borrowing from you? In other words, what is the interest rate the company will pay you? Surely it would have to be more than the interest rate on a 10-year US Treasury. A 10-year US Treasury is as risk-free as it gets. On the other hand, there is a chance, even if it's small, that ConocoPhillips could go bankrupt and default on its bond. And for that risk, you should be compensated. In Conoco's case, it ended up offering an interest rate 75 basis points or 0.75% higher than the rate on the 10-year US Treasury. So yesterday, when these bonds were issued, the US Treasury was trading at a yield of about 4.25%. So you could have bought those treasuries and earned 4.25% each year for the next 10 years. Or you could have bought the bonds from Conoco, these newly issued 10-year bonds, at an interest rate of 5%. So that 5% is the 75 basis points or 0.75% more than the 4.25% on the US Treasury, and that's the compensation that investors required in order to lend money to Conoco. The third main type of bond, mortgage-backed securities. They account for 25% of the index, so similar in magnitude to corporate bonds. If you buy mortgage-backed securities, you are in essence lending to people to buy homes. When these homeowners pay their mortgage principal and interest, it passes through to you, the investor. That's what makes these bonds different animals. US Treasuries and corporate bonds are considered bullet securities, meaning that if you buy a $1,000 10-year corporate bond, you'll collect interest payments for 9 years and then get interest and the full $1,000 of principal back at the end of the 10th year. Mortgage-backed securities are amortizing securities, meaning that you get your interest and principal back each month. If you hear mortgage-backed securities and immediately think back to some of the excesses that led to the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, these are not those. The primary culprits back then were private label mortgage-backed securities. The mortgage-backed securities that make up 25% of the AG are essentially backed by the US government, so there's virtually no risk of principal loss here. So there is the US Bond Aggregate Index. I should note that it doesn't include the entire US bond universe. It excludes corporate junk bonds, tax-free municipal bonds, and floating rate bonds. But it does get us most of the way there, as it tracks close to 70% of the US bond market. That's all for now. Have a nice Thanksgiving, and I'll see you in a month.